Okay, today we're going to be talking about a little bit of an unusual topic. It's called in vitro fertilization of cows. So let's first explain what's going on here. It's very common on farms, like farms that they will artificially inseminate the cows, which is to say, is they collect semen in what they call a straw, and they insert it into the cow's cervix using what they call a gun. And they place that into the vaginal canal, and they insert the semen using that. Now, there doesn't seem to be any way that could cause trephas in the cow, so that procedure is fine. That doesn't raise any questions at all. However, there are other cases where instead of just doing artificial insemination, they use in vitro fertilization. In vitro, the word vitro is a Latin word. It literally means glass, because this is traditionally, this what I'm about to describe, or the beginnings of this, would be done in glass. And what it means is they fertilize a cow's eggs in a lab, and then instead of inserting the semen into the cow, they're putting a fertilized egg into there, and they put it back in basically in the same kind of a way that they would have put the semen in also, and now they put in an already fertilized embryo, and then the cow carries it and gives birth to however many months later. Now, of course, you want to know is, why would anybody do that? What's the reason for that? We do in vitro fertilization for humans is because someone can't have a child, and they want, or in a natural means, so they want to use this as a way to have a child. What's with the cow? Cows aren't complaining that they aren't having any kids. So there's a couple of reasons. It'll help us just a little bit to understand what's going on here. And some of them are like this. One reason is if you get the eggs, the eggs from one of your best cows. Okay, and those cows have different features that make them better or worse for what the farmer wants. So you take eggs from the best cow when, let's say, that your, so to speak, best cow is now pregnant, or it had just given birth, so it can't become pregnant again. So, but it still has lots of eggs in its ovaries. So you take eggs from her, take eggs from her to put into other cows, because you want those eggs, because they have some, there's some properties or features of that cow that you want to reproduce. Or what happens if you have cows that are fertile, but they can't carry a calf to term. There's something wrong with them. They had some injury or something like that, and they won't be able to carry their baby to term. So you take the eggs from them and put them into a different cow. Or you have a cow that's not producing eggs at all. Something's wrong with their ovaries. They're not producing eggs at all, but the opposite of the last one, they could carry the cow. They could carry a baby. So you take eggs from a different cow, put into this cow, so it doesn't have its own, so you get a donation from somebody else, and then it can carry. Okay, so but the long and short of it is, for all these different reasons why you might do that, is that the donor cow, I mean the one who's giving the egg, is not the same cow as the host egg, as a host cow, the one who's going to carry the baby. In other words, in a human in vitro fertilization, the egg will go back to that same person. Here, that's not what's going on. You're taking the egg from one cow, as I mentioned, these bunch of reasons why you do it. You take the egg from one cow, and in the lab, you fertilize it, and then you take the embryo and put it into a different cow. Okay, now, the second part of this process, which is to say, is once we have the embryo, we put it back into the cow, we call the host cow. That doesn't have any issues, as I just mentioned, doesn't have any possibilities of making the animal into a treifa. So the animal that was impregnated through the in vitro will stay kosher. No trial about that. Now, just to understand what the issue is, if that cow had been considered a treifa, then the calf that it gives birth to would be kosher. That's a din siman ein test. That the cow that would be born would be a treifa, but milk from the host cow would not be kosher, assuming it was made into a treifa somehow in this procedure. But it's not. The procedure doesn't do anything. So the host cow, the one who's carrying the baby, the calf, who will be pregnant and eventually give birth to this cow, that cow has no issues to it. Everything's fine with it. The question we want to talk about is, does the procedure to take the eggs out of the donor cow make that cow into a treifa? And that would be relevant to us, because it would mean is milk from that cow, or eventually if we shech the cow, the meat from it also, but the milk from that cow would be treif. Okay, so what we want to understand is that donor cow, is that cow become a treifa during this procedure? Now, the way you do it, the way you get get the cows from the eggs from the donor cow, is they insert a tool into the vagina of the cow, so transvaginally, and that tool punctures the vaginal walls of the ovaries, so that you could aspirate some eggs from it, so suck out some eggs out of there, and then those eggs now have been captured, and then you take them to the lab and fertilize them, etc., etc. So our question is the puncturing of those ovaries make the cow into a treifa? That's the focus of what our question is going to be about. Now let's think. There's different levels to this question. The first, like this. There's a Mishnah which says pretty straightforward. It's important in Simon, Mem Hey in Shulchan Aruch, that if you take nitel ha'aim, if you take away the animal's uterus, you take it completely, it's gone, taken out. The animal is not a treifa. Okay, the Mishnah doesn't say what happens if you make a hole in the uterus. Nikav, it doesn't say. It only says nitel ha'aim. So most assume that if you made a hole, would not make it a treifa. Why is that? And that's because like this. There's a general rule that if you have a part of the body, which if you made a hole in it, would make it into a treifa. Let's say the lungs. If there was a hole in the lungs, the animal would be a treifa. There's a rule that says this rule is brought in Siman Nun in Shulchan Aruch. The rule is if that whole organ is missing, then the animal is a treifa also. Okay, so a hole in the lungs would make the animal into a treifa. That's a fair Mishnah. That would make the animal a treifa. So if you remove the lungs, if there were no lungs at all, then the animal is also a treifa. Okay, that's a general rule. It's put in Siman Nun. So that means if a hole in the uterus would make the animal into a treifa, well, then if we remove the uterus completely, it would also be a treifa. Well, since we know that if you remove the whole uterus, the animal is not a treifa, so we could figure out backwards, ipso facto, we come out backwards, that it must be that a hole would not make it a treifa, because if the hole would make it into a treifa, then removing the whole uterus would for sure make it a treifa. Okay, so we could backtrack to say that having a hole in the uterus would not make the animal into a treifa. This is the first sheet that brought in the Ramah in Siman Mem Hey. Okay, that's the first sheet in the Ramah. However, others argue, and they say no, a hole in the uterus will make the animal into a treifa, and it's like there are some exceptions to that rule that I just told you. If you look in Siman Nun, you see there's an exception, like the spleen is an exception, where a hole in the spleen makes animal treifa, but if you remove the whole spleen, it's not. There are exceptions. What I told you before is the general rule that if there's a hole makes it a treifa, then removing the whole aver will make it a treifa also. But there are exceptions. So some hold that this is another exception. So that even though removing the whole uterus does not make it a treifa, if you had a hole in it, it would make the animal into a treifa. And the Ramah says that you should be machmir for that shita except in makom hefsem meruba. Okay, now the Taz goes along with this. The Taz. And the Chacham they go along with this thing that you should be machmir for a hole in the uterus, even except in makom hefsem meruba. The Shach doesn't. He doesn't agree with it at all. He says no, it's not true. You don't have to be Kosher at all. And Pri Megadim says that even the machmirim who say that a hole in the uterus would make the animal into a treifa, they say that's only true in cases where the hole comes about because of an illness. But if it was made by a human intervention, like in our case, where someone poked a hole in it, they stuck a needle into it, then everybody agrees that the animal is not a treifa. Okay, so we have over here let's pause here for a second. Is that our question here is maybe poking the needle in makes the animal into a treifa. So we saw that many hold that a hole in the uterus is not a problem at all. It means nothing. Doesn't make animal treifa. And some said. And the Pri Megadim is saying is even if that is an issue, it's only an issue if that happens by itself. It develops a hole, like the animal is sick. But if you make a hole by a person makes the hole, that doesn't cause a problem. There's no issue at all. Okay, so that's one possible reason to say is the animal's not a treifa because the hole in the uterus doesn't have a problem at all. Okay, now let's approach that from a different angle. That is like this: that let's even say that a hole in the uterus is a problem. Okay, let's even say a hole in the uterus would make the animal into a treifa. Over here, our hole is not in the uterus. The hole is in the ovaries. Remember, they stick the needle in into the animal's vaginal canal, and then they poke into the ovaries and suck out eggs from there. So, does that make the animal a treifa? Let's even say that having a hole in the uterus makes the animal to a treifa. Does it make it a treifa if there's a hole in the ovaries? Is that the same thing? So, when talking about a hole in a bird's ovaries, the Dr. Moshe says, the Dr. Moshe is in Siman Nun Aleph. Dr. Moshe assumes that's the same thing as having a hole in the uterus. Okay, he's talking about it for a bird. He assumes it's the same thing. But the Pri Megadim by us in Memhei says like this. He disagrees. He says like this. That's what it is. That's the ovaries. The uterus is the ovaries are in the uterus. And we only have to worry about a hole in the uterus, in the mayan, but not if there's a hole in the shlal. Okay? So he's saying is, the Pri Megadim is telling us is that a hole in the ovaries does not make the bird into a treifa. Okay? That's what he's saying. So he's saying a hole in the ovaries is not a problem. It's only a problem if there's a hole in the uterus. But really, if we think about it, it could be that he actually would be machmir in our case. And that's like this. Because the Pri Megadim says, hamayin, the uterus, im nikav treifa, v'loy hashlal. It's only a problem if there's a hole in the uterus, not a hole in the ovaries. That we only have a problem making it a hole if it's in the uterus. Okay, now, but the truth is, he's really the Pri Megadim says is that the ovaries are part of the uterus. He says the aim that the uterus is the mayan, same thing that the shlal, that the ovaries are inside of it. So why is it if the ovaries are part of the uterus, why isn't a hole in the ovaries also enough to make it a treifa? If a hole in the uterus makes it a treifa, why wouldn't a hole in the ovaries also make it a treifa? So the answer is that he's explaining to us why the hole in a bird's ovaries don't make it a treifa. Birds don't have uteruses. Okay? A uterus is the place where the baby is going to develop and be held until it's ready to be born. Okay, birds don't have that. So there's no way to say that the hole in a bird's ovaries is going to be considered a hole in the Nikav ha'aim. There's no hole in the uterus because birds don't have uteruses altogether. So therefore, in a bird, we wouldn't say that a hole in the ovaries makes the bird into a treifa. Okay, but when we're talking about an animal, we're talking about an animal like a cow that has a uterus, then it's different. It can be like this. If there's a hole between the ovaries and the rest of the uterus, okay, like in the fallopian tubes, there's a hole between the ovaries and the rest of the uterus, then that's fine. The animal won't be a treifa, because first of all, it's not a hole in the ovaries, and also it's not a hole in the a hole in the ovaries per se is not enough to make it a treifa like we saw by birth. It has to be a hole in the uterus, and this is not. This is a hole is internal. Okay, like there's a din that if there's a hole between the hemsis and the base of Kashrus, two of the second and third stomach of a cow, if there's a hole between them, they're connected to each other. If there's a hole between them, then the animal's not a treifa. It's in Siman Memches. The animal's not a treifa because in a way they're like one organ. Because they're connected to each other, that they're attached to each other, it's sort of like one. It's like a hole internal to the organ. So here also, if there would be a hole between the ovaries and the uterus, the animal would not be a treifa. But if there would be an external hole in the ovaries, remember the Pri Megadim says is that the ovaries are considered part of the uterus. So only by a bird where there is no uterus altogether, then we don't worry about it. Then Pri Megadim says, I don't agree with Ramah, with the Dr. Moshe. I don't agree with him, and a hole in the ovaries doesn't make a difference because there's no uterus. You can't say it's a hole in the uterus, but in our ovaries, which are part of the uterus, there is a uterus there, and it's considered part of the aim. So then a hole on the outside of the ovaries would be a problem. Okay, that would be a hole in the aim, which Ramah says we should be machmir on l'chatchila. Okay, in our case, when they make a hole, the hole that we're making is not between the ovaries and the uterus. It's not on the inside. It's not an internal hole. It's on an external hole. You make the hole coming from the vagina, making a hole on the outside of the ovaries to get eggs out. Then l'chayra, that would be then this. Pri Megadim is not going to help us. We should look at this as a hole in the aim, a hole in the in the uterus, we go back to what we said beforehand, that look, the Ramah says you should be machmir except makom hefsem ruba, although the Pri Megadim says maybe you could be makel if it's done by a human instead of natural. Okay, so this Pri Megadim who was makel about ovaries of a bird is seemingly not helping us over here to be makel. However, Reb Chaim Aaron Unger had another reason to be makel, and that is like this. He said is that the hole that you make to get the eggs out is not, from our purposes, is not considered a hole. Okay, I mean, of course it's a hole, but from din wise, it's not considered a hole, and that's because when you make the hole in the ovaries to suck out some of the eggs, invariably that hole is not going to go all the way through the hole, through all the eggs to what's called the ovarian cavity, like the empty space. And the ovaries is this cluster of eggs that are not yet developed, like a cluster of eggs. Inside of it is this cavity on the inside of it, the ovarian cavity. The needle is not going to go all the way deep in. It's going to go in a little bit, suck out some eggs, and go out and leave. And therefore, that would make that the hole that it makes would not be considered a Nikav Mefulash, a hole that goes all the way through. Okay, now, in many cases where a hole makes an animal to a treifa, the din is very clear that the hole has to be a Nikav Mefulash. It has to go all the way through. We say it by the Krom HaMayach and the Veshet and the Reya and the Tarpish and the Tchol and the Hemsis and Beis, a poke is not enough to make the animal a treifa. It has to be Mefulash. It has to go all the way through to the cavity on the inside. Okay, now, there are some cases where it's not true. There are some cases where Nikav makes animal treifa, even if it's not Mefulash, but usually it has to be Mefulash. And Dr. Tshuva, here in Siman Memhei, says from the Das Kedoshim that for a Nikav aim, the hole has to be Mefulash. It's like most cases where a Nikav does not an issue unless the Nikav is Mefulash all the way through. So over here, the Nikav is not going to be Mefulash, not going to go all the way through to the ovarian cavity. The animal would not be a treifa when we take the eggs out for in vitro fertilization. So just to summarize, there's a couple of reasons to think that the eggs taken from the cow for in vitro, the animal will not become a treifa, and they are, the Ramah himself says you should only be machmir b'makom hefsem ruba, which means the ikra din is that a nikav aim is not a treifa. Okay, that's the mechaber holds of that for sure. And the Ramah even himself is only being machmir for ikra din. We know from the way he introduces to Teres Chatas, and when he says that he just means to be machmir l'chatchila, but really ikra din is that it's mutter. Some achronim don't even agree with the Ramah altogether. They say it could be makel even without hefsem ruba. The Pri Megadim said that you could be makel if the hole is result of human intervention instead of an illness. And Leas is Das Kedoshim, who says that the hole that we need to have here has to be Nikav Mefulash, which is not what's going to happen here. Okay, so those are all reasons to think that moving the eggs to set up an in vitro fertilization for a cow would not make the donor cow a treifa. And as we mentioned, the host cow, the one who's going to receive the in vitro, there's no shayla that animal is not a treifa.